second of patriarchy. And this often includes home was his castle, and the police really took a hands-off policy towards dealing with, you know, domestic violence in the home. Then we've sort of got this moderate correction where people are talking about there's no permanent damage done. And then we also talk about an unnatural, see, and if you were abusing your wife, it was really up to the judge what would happen. So first thing we want to think about when we talk about violence committed against someone by a family member or a loved one, which victim-offender relationship should be included or excluded. We also want to think about how we define abuse. Are we talking about just injuries and attacking? This definition. What about violence is criminal violence? And there tends to be a lack of public consensus on this. So one thing to think about is to think about which terminology you're using. If you're using the word domestic violence, we're talking about where there's an existing romantic relationship, or roommates are also included in domestic violence as well. So anybody who lives in your home with you, if you had a violent altercation with them, that would be considered domestic violence. We also sometimes talk about interpersonal violence, okay? And so that's, or intimate partner violence, rather. And that's where we're talking about not necessarily somebody that you live with, but your significant other or a former significant other. So remember we talked about those maximalist and those minimalist arguments, and that they tend to be at two opposite ends of the spectrum. So just the thing to think about in terms of a maximalist argument. We do know that women are much more likely to be harmed by an intimate partner than a stranger. Most of the time, people know the person that has victimized them. Nearly 25% of women will be victims of severe physical violence at the hands of their partner. About half of all incidents are not reported to the police, and violence against women is the leading cause of female homelessness. Minimalists argue that only 3 in 1,000 women aged 12 or older experience non-fatal violent offenses in a given year. And the NCVS shows trends for domestic violence decreasing. One thing to remember, think about what we talked about before, that when we're looking at statistics, we might be looking at reporting increasing or decreasing, although the NCVS is not dealing with official police statistics. So in 2012, about 12% of all murders in which the police knew what the victim-offender relationship is, I want to say it's roughly 40% where the police do not know what the victim-offender relationship is. But when we do know what it is, about 12% of those arose out of a conflict between intimate partners. In 1996, it was about 16%. So we do see a little bit of a drop there. A declining percent of murders involve deadly assaults amongst husband and wives, and a growing percent reflect fatal unmarried lovers' quarrels. So we're seeing these incidents decreasing between husbands and wives and increasing between people who are not married. And that's probably because people are delaying marriage, people are living together, and so we're seeing more long-term unmarried couples as well. We might also see a decline in these murders because women have other options today that they didn't have in the past. And they're probably more aware of those options. So they may be choosing to leave situations. So let's start with, why does a battered woman stay? This is sort of, a question that comes up a lot, or why does someone take the person back? And we want to think about, we want to remember that these people, women, men as well, are experiencing, battered woman syndrome. Okay, and this is a cycle. So the battering comes in a cycle. There's usually tension building, okay? Then there's a violent event, an explosion. And then there's sort of this honeymoon period afterwards where the offender is apologetic and says that he or she is sorry and it will never happen again. And then the tension builds up again. Okay, so there's sort of, I don't really like this phrase, learned helplessness, but it is important to remember and to kind of take some time to read a little bit about what happens to someone who's battered and how that impacts how they see themselves and whether or not they will leave the relationship. We also want to keep in mind that the most dangerous time for a person is actually the moment where they do leave the relationship. So leaving doesn't always mean safety. So in terms of the criminal justice system, we got different approaches to this. So in the past, people have really looked at this. How can we help preserve the family? I can remember hearing a story about, a therapist who was sitting down with a couple, and he told the person who was being hit that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Okay? Essentially telling that person, if you're not helping your partner get better, then you're part of the problem. So women are not totally innocent. There's some shared responsibility here, with the long-term approach being to strengthen that bond. Since the 1980s, we've really taken much more of a legalistic model. Okay, so we generally separate the parties. We often encourage people to get an order of protection. We also want to protect the injured person, punish and rehabilitate the aggressor. And we do know that arresting people may deter future acts. So there have been some research projects that have gone on that have really looked at mandatory and preferred arrest, and whether or not those have an impact on future arrests, whether or not someone continues to batter. So there's a Minneapolis study where they looked at police response. I think if I remember correctly, they broke people up into 3 different groups. And when a call came in, it was randomly assigned to one of 3 interventions. Okay. So people who were arrested were half as likely to reassault the victim. So there was a real, significant difference here. About 26% of those who were forced to leave reoffended upon return, and about 18% of those sent to counseling reoffended in a follow-up period. So we do know that the best response is to arrest somebody. Okay, that does seem to be the safest response. So in the past, a lot of times the police might pull someone aside. They might be like, yeah, women, you know how they are. Why don't you go down the street, cool off for a little while? Now places either generally have mandatory arrest or they have preferred arrest. In terms of prosecutors, a lot of times people would be discouraging women from pressing charges, and they are often manipulated into dropping charges. So in many places, they have a no-drop approach, no-drop policy. The prosecutor only needs corroborating evidence if the victim does not testify. So in a lot of places, they will go forward even if the victim chooses not to testify. And some of that is reflective of the fact that many times battered women and battered men are frightened to testify. They're frightened to leave their significant other. And so, they can be manipulated into dropping charges. If the accuser fails to show up at trial, though, cases are often dropped or the defendant might be acquitted. In terms of judges often dispose of these cases because they can involve lengthy trials. But judges can order the person evicted from the home, limited visitation. They can put in a no contact order. They can insist upon child support, compel treatment, and generally once someone's been arrested for domestic violence, they are forced to surrender their weapons. Civil remedies, right? So when we deal with again, eviction, visitation, no contact orders, they're aimed at separating the couple. But law enforcement doesn't vigorously enforce these. Basically what a restraining order is going to do is it's going to allow you to press charges if the person violates it. It doesn't really stop somebody from violating it. Okay, we do know also, though, that women are not the only people who are battered. So husbands can be battered as well. And then we also have, the issue of same-sex relationships. So less than 15% of all perpetrators of violence against partners were women. Women attack men nearly as often as men attack women, but they're less likely to cause injury. Male victims are hesitant to report, right? So they feel like people won't believe them or people will make fun of them. They often don't have access to any resources. But men have had a long history of being better able to support themselves, so it's often much easier for them to leave a relationship. They're really stalked, really brought back, and really beaten again, whereas this happens with women, quite frequently. So when we think about this, and we talked before about victim facilitation, victim provocation. When is slaying a wife beater justified? That's a really loaded question, right? But when basically does it constitute self-defense? And we talked about this a little bit in our last Collaborate. And so here we're looking at victim blaming versus victim defending. So generally we know in order to use self-defense, someone has to be facing an imminent harm. But courts have been a little lenient sometimes in looking at what constitutes an imminent harm when someone has been battered on a regular basis. So victim defending arguments right, will often side with, remember, the victim in this case would be the dead perpetrator, okay? So they might note his provocations are not sufficient to justify his death, right? They might also note that she has overreacted. This leads to offender blaming that she must be punished accordingly. The violence went too far. She should have called the police, left the home, or gotten divorced. People will argue women cannot be judge, jury, and executioner. And the man cannot defend himself in court when she says all these things because, of course, he is gone. Victim blaming arguments. So again, remember, the victim here is the dead wife beater. The dead husband is responsible for his own demise. His insults, challenges, and assaults incited her. Those who strike back are socially and economically isolated, more severely beaten, often have children who are being abused as well. And that basically the deadly force is justified as self-defense. The use of a weapon could be justified due to inherent differences in strength between the man and the woman. An abusive man, even without a weapon, can be a legitimate threat to a woman's life. The victim blaming approach is most convincing when the killer has been threatened or beaten repeatedly, has been rescued in the past by the police, has had an order of protection, has testified in court, sought counseling, attempted escape, filed for divorce. These are all things that really show, that there was a pattern here, and that the man, that the person may have provoked their own death. Now, remember, this really shows us that crimes are a social construct, right? No act is inherently criminal, even homicide, right? Because there are times when it can be justified to take someone's life, that we're really defining these things socially. When is something considered inappropriate behavior? When is that behavior considered criminal? So we've also seen this in terms of dating violence. February is Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We also hear stories of parents who are abused by adolescents, elders who are abused by their caretakers or their children. And then we also know that there's battering within same-sex relationships. So it's not always a man battering a woman or a woman battering a man. It could be a woman battering a woman or a man battering a man. So what are some options here, right? How do we prevent this? Well, we can make primary prevention attempts. This is where we try to change the attitudes of large numbers of people. So this could be through programming, through a high school, through doing something like recognizing, Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month and doing some activities and providing some education around that. We can also do prevention where we try to intervene, secondary prevention, where we're trying to intervene in the lives of high-risk couples. Teach them how to negotiate, teach them how to manage their anger. But most of our current responses don't deal with the root problem. So decision-making in family flows with income and property. So men often have more power, women are often subordinate to them. Men are often taught to be aggressive while women are taught to be passive and, to sort of be peacemakers. So remember, wedding vows say to love, honor, and, quote, obey. And so some people take that literally. Okay, and that wraps up our chapter.